The Winchester rifle was already in Florence Fletcher's hands before the rider crested the ridge. Her practiced movements as automatic as breathing after 5 years of solitary vigilance on this unforgiving stretch of Montana territory. The autumn sun of 1878 cast long shadows across her property, and she had learned long ago that shadows could hide all manner of threats. Her finger rested alongside the trigger guard, not on the trigger itself, because despite everything this land had demanded of her, she remained disciplined. The rider came on slowly, hands visible, and something about the deliberate pace made her pause rather than fire a warning shot into the dirt as she had done with the last 3 men who had mistaken her solitude for weakness. "That is far enough," Florence called out when he reached the split-rail fence that marked the boundary of her grazing land. Her voice carried strong across the distance, though her heart hammered against her ribs the way it always did when strangers appeared. The homestead sat in a shallow valley 15 miles north of Virginia City, isolated enough that visitors were rare and rarely came with good intentions. The man reined in his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding that looked trail-worn but well cared for. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days' worth of beard shadowing his jaw. His clothes were dusty from travel, and he wore his gun low on his hip in a way that suggested familiarity but not showmanship. "Madam," he said, tipping his hat with a slow, careful movement. "Name is Wesley Randall. I am looking for work, and I heard in town you might need a hand with the coming winter." "You heard wrong." Florence kept the rifle steady. "I manage fine on my own." Wesley Randall sat easy in his saddle, making no move toward his weapon. "With respect, madam, I passed 3 sections of your fence on the way up here that need mending before the snow flies. Your barn roof has missing shingles on the north side. And those cattle I saw in the lower pasture, they will need to be moved to higher ground and closer to shelter within the month." Florence felt her jaw tighten. She knew all of this, had known it for weeks, but there were only so many hours in a day and only one of her. "I will manage," she repeated, putting steel in her voice. "Now turn that horse around and ride back the way you came." "I will work for room and board until the first snow," Wesley said, as if she had not spoken. "After that, we can discuss wages if you want me to stay through winter. I can mend fence, repair buildings, handle livestock, and I am handy with a hammer and saw. I do not drink, I do not gamble, and I do not cause trouble." "I do not need help," Florence said, even as part of her screamed that she was a fool to turn away able-bodied assistance. But she had learned caution through bitter experience, had learned that men often promised one thing and delivered another, especially when they found a woman alone. Wesley studied her for a long moment, and she found herself noticing his eyes were a warm brown, steady and direct. "Begging your pardon, madam, but I think you do. And I think you have been managing alone for so long that you have forgotten what it is like to have someone to depend on. I am not asking you to trust me right off. Keep that rifle handy if it makes you feel safer. But I am asking you to let me prove I am a man of my word." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains and the first hint of the cold that would soon settle in for months. Florence looked at this stranger, at his tired horse, at the honest wear on his clothes and gear, and felt the weight of every repair she had not been able to make, every task she had postponed, every night she had fallen into bed so exhausted she could barely pull off her boots. "You sleep in the barn," she said finally, lowering the rifle slightly. "You take your meals on the porch, not in the house. You work dawn to dusk, and if I catch you doing anything I do not like, I will shoot you. Not to wound, to kill. Do we understand each other?" "Yes, madam." Wesley dismounted, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. I will need to unsaddle my horse and get him settled. Then I will start on that fence before the light goes." Florence watched him lead his horse toward the barn, her rifle still ready, her instincts still screaming caution even as relief flooded through her. She had turned away help before, had fired warning shots and stood her ground until men rode off cursing her for a crazy woman. But something about Wesley Randall had made her hesitate, and she could not quite put her finger on what. That first evening, she brought his dinner out to the porch as promised. Venison stew with vegetables from her garden, fresh bread, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. Wesley was washing up at the pump when she set the plate down, and she retreated to the doorway to watch as he dried his hands and settled onto the top step. "This is mighty fine, madam," he said after the first bite. "Best meal I have had in weeks. You have been on the trail long." "Near about 2 months. Came up from Wyoming way, looking for a place that felt right to settle." He ate with the focused attention of a man who had known real hunger, not rushing but not wasting a bite either. "Why Montana?" Florence asked, surprising herself with the question. She had not intended to make conversation, had planned to maintain distance and formality. Wesley looked out at the mountains, their peaks already dusted with early snow. "Got tired of drifting." A man reaches a point where he wants something that is his, something to build instead of just passing through. Montana seemed like a place where a fellow could still find that. Florence understood that sentiment bone deep. This land had been her husband's dream, the homestead they were going to build together, before fever had taken him in the 3rd year, before she had learned she was stronger than she ever imagined she could be. Montana does not give up its bounty easy. Nothing worth having ever does. Wesley finished his meal and stood, carrying the plate back to the porch rail. "Thank you for the food, madam, and for the chance. I will not make you regret it." The next morning, Florence woke before dawn as always and found Wesley already at work on the fence, his breath misting in the cold air. She watched from the window as he measured and cut new rails, his movements efficient and sure. By the time she had breakfast ready, he had replaced an entire section that had been listing dangerously for a month. The days fell into a rhythm. Wesley worked from sunup to sundown, tackling the endless list of repairs and maintenance that Florence had been struggling to keep up with alone. He fixed the barn roof, mended fences, cleared the irrigation ditches, and moved the cattle to better pasture. He worked without complaint, without expectation of praise, and he kept his distance as she had demanded. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, that distance began to close. It started with small things. Wesley asking her opinion on the best way to reinforce the corral. Florence pointing out which trees needed cutting for winter firewood. Brief conversations at mealtimes that stretched longer each day. "You built all this yourself?" Wesley asked one evening, gesturing at the homestead as he finished his dinner. "My husband and I started it together," Florence said, the words still catching in her throat even after 5 years. "Robert died of fever our 3rd winter here. I finished what we started." Wesley was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry for your loss, but I am impressed by your strength." Not many people, man or woman, could have held on alone. "I did not have a choice." Florence wrapped her arms around herself against the evening chill. This land was everything to Robert. Giving it up would have meant his dream died for nothing. "I could not let that happen. Still takes grit." Wesley stood, stretching out the kinks from a long day's work. "If you do not mind my saying, you have done a remarkable job. The bones of this place are solid." The praise warmed her more than it should have. Florence had grown so accustomed to speaking only to herself, to having no one acknowledge her efforts, that Wesley's simple recognition touched something deep inside her she had thought long buried. As October gave way to November, the first real snow arrived. Florence woke to find 3 inches blanketing the valley, and when she looked out, Wesley was already breaking ice in the water troughs and making sure the livestock had access to the shelter he had reinforced in previous weeks. She pulled on her coat and boots and went out to help, and they worked side by side in companionable silence, their breath mingling in clouds of vapor. "Storm is coming," Wesley said, studying the sky. "Big one if I am reading the signs right." Florence followed his gaze. The clouds were heavy and dark, moving fast. "We should bring the cattle in closer, make sure everything is battened down." They spent the day in preparation, and when the storm hit that night, it hit hard. Snow fell thick and fast, driven by winds that howled around the buildings and found every crack and gap. Florence lay in her bed listening to the fury outside, grateful for once that she was not facing it entirely alone. The barn was solid, and she knew the animals were safe. Wesley was there too, bedded down in the tack room, and somehow his presence brought comfort she had not realized she needed. The storm lasted 3 days. When it finally broke, they emerged to find the world transformed. Snow had drifted high against the buildings, and the temperature had plummeted. Wesley and Florence worked together to dig out, to tend the animals, to make sure nothing had been damaged beyond repair. There was an intimacy in shared struggle, in working toward a common goal that Florence had not experienced since Robert's death. "You should come inside," she said one evening as the temperature dropped well below freezing. "It is too cold in the barn." Wesley looked surprised. "Madam, I do not want to presume." "You are not presuming. I am offering. There is a spare room that was meant to be for hired hands. It seems foolish to let you freeze when there is space." He moved his belongings in that night, taking the small room off the kitchen that Florence had not opened in years. She felt strange having someone else in the house, heard every creak of the floorboards as he settled in, but it was not an unpleasant strangeness. It felt almost like the house was coming back to life. They began taking meals together at the kitchen table instead of separately on the porch. Florence discovered that Wesley was well-read despite his lack of formal education, that he had opinions about everything from politics to poetry, and that he had a dry sense of humor that occasionally caught her off guard and made her laugh. She could not remember the last time she had laughed. "Where did you grow up?" she asked one evening over stew. "Kansas, mostly. My father had a farm, but he lost it after the war. We drifted after that. He took work where he could find it." Wesley's expression grew distant. "He died when I was 16, kicked by a horse. After that I worked cattle drives, did ranch work, whatever paid, never stayed anywhere long enough to call it home." "Is that what you are looking for? A home?" Wesley met her eyes across the table. "I think so. Took me a long time to realize that is what was missing. A man can only drift so long before he needs an anchor." Florence understood that need, had felt the pull of this land as an anchor through all the storms of the past 5 years. "This place has been my anchor. I do not know who I would be without it." "You would be the same strong woman you are," Wesley said quietly. "The land did not make you that. You brought that to the land." The words settled around her like a warm blanket, and Florence felt something shift in her chest. She had been so focused on surviving, on proving she could manage alone, that she had forgotten what it felt like to be seen as more than just a stubbornly independent widow. Wesley saw her strength, but he also seemed to see the woman beneath it. December brought deeper cold and shorter days. They worked together to keep the livestock fed and watered, to haul firewood, to maintain the fragile balance that meant survival through a Montana winter. Florence found herself relying on Wesley's strength for the heavy work, and he seemed to naturally look to her for decisions about the homestead. They were becoming partners without ever discussing it, slipping into an easy partnership that felt as natural as breathing. On Christmas Eve, Florence surprised herself by cooking a special meal. Roasted chicken from her flock, potatoes and carrots from the root cellar, and a dried apple pie sweetened with precious sugar. Wesley came in from evening chores to find the table set properly, and his face lit up with genuine pleasure. "This is wonderful," he said. "I had not expected any celebration." "It seemed wrong not to mark the day," Florence said, feeling suddenly shy. "Even out here." They ate by lamplight, the windows dark around them, the world reduced to this warm circle of light and food and companionship. Wesley had carved a small bird from pine wood and shyly presented it to her as a gift. It was a meadowlark, Montana's songbird, detailed and delicate. "I worked on it in the evenings," he said. "I hope you do not think it is too forward." Florence held the carving gently, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "It is beautiful. I love it." She had nothing to give him in return, felt embarrassed by her lack of preparation, but Wesley waved off her apologies. "You gave me a place when I had none," he said. "You trusted me when you had every reason not to. That is gift enough for any man." After dinner, they sat by the fireplace, and Wesley asked if she would tell him about Robert. Florence found herself talking about her late husband for the first time in years, sharing memories she had kept locked away because there had been no one to share them with. Robert's laugh, his dreams for the homestead, the way he had loved this wild country even as it challenged them at every turn. "He sounds like a good man," Wesley said when she fell silent. "He was. I loved him very much." Florence stared into the fire. "But he has been gone 5 years now. Sometimes I feel guilty for not grieving him every moment, for having days where I am so busy I barely think of him." "I think he would want you to live," Wesley said gently. "Not just survive, but really live. Honor his memory by building the life he dreamed of, not by shutting yourself away from everything else." The words pierced something in Florence's chest, brought tears to her eyes for the first time in longer than she could remember. Wesley reached over and took her hand, and she let him, let herself accept the comfort of human touch after so long alone. January was brutal. Temperatures stayed below zero for days at a time, and the wind cut like knives. They stayed close to the buildings, venturing out only when necessary to care for the animals. Florence was grateful for Wesley's presence, for the way he shouldered half the burden without being asked, for the companionship that made the long, dark nights bearable. One morning, she woke to find the fire had gone out during the night and ice had formed on the inside of the windows. She hurried to restart the fire with numb fingers, and Wesley emerged from his room already dressed, immediately moving to help. "We should have kept the fire going," he said, feeding kindling into the struggling flames. "I usually do, but I was so tired last night." Florence wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, shivering. "It will catch soon enough," but the cold had seeped into everything. Even when the fire blazed, the house remained frigid. Wesley went out to check on the livestock and came back with grim news. "The cattle are all right, but one of the horses is off his feed. I am worried about him." They spent the day nursing the sick horse, and that night the temperature dropped even further. Florence lay in her bed, piled with every blanket she owned, and still could not get warm. She heard Wesley moving around in his room, clearly having the same problem. After an hour of shivering, she got up and knocked on his door. "Wesley." He opened it immediately, wrapped in his bedroll. "Madam, it is too cold to sleep separately. We should share body heat." The words came out in a rush, businesslike despite the intimacy they suggested. "It is just practical survival." Wesley hesitated only a moment before nodding. "I agree. Your room or mine?" They ended up in the main bedroom, which was slightly larger and held the big bed Robert had built. They lay down together, fully clothed, maintaining a respectful distance at first. But as the night wore on and the cold intensified, they moved closer together, sharing warmth. Florence felt Wesley's steady breathing against her back, his arm eventually coming around her waist, and instead of feeling threatened or uncomfortable, she felt safe for the first time in 5 years. Morning brought slightly warmer temperatures and profound awkwardness. They rose and went about their chores without discussing what had happened, both carefully polite. But that night, when the cold returned, there was no discussion. They simply went to bed together, and this time there was less distance between them. Over the following weeks, sleeping together became routine. They still maintained propriety, still kept their clothes on and their hands to themselves, but the intimacy of shared sleep, of waking together, of the quiet conversations in the dark before sleep claimed them, brought them closer than any physical relationship could have. "I never thought I would feel this way again," Florence confessed one night. "After Robert died, I thought that part of my life was over." "What way?" Wesley's voice was soft in the darkness, safe, cared for, like I am not carrying everything alone. She turned to face him, barely able to make out his features in the dim light. "You have become important to me, Wesley. More important than I intended to let anyone become." "You are important to me too," he said, reaching up to cup her face gently. "I have been falling in love with you since the day you let me stay. I know it might be too soon, that you might not feel the same way, but I needed you to know." Florence's heart hammered in her chest. Part of her wanted to pull away, to protect herself from the risk of loving and losing again. But a larger part, the part that had come alive again over these past months, wanted to lean into this feeling, to embrace the possibility of happiness. "I am afraid," she whispered. "I am afraid to love you and lose you like I lost Robert." "Life does not come with guarantees," Wesley said. "But I can promise you that I will do everything in my power to stay by your side for as long as you will have me. I love you, Florence. I want to build a life with you, to be your partner in all things." She kissed him then, closing the distance between them with a decisiveness that surprised them both. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened as 5 years of loneliness and longing poured out of her. Wesley responded with equal passion, his arms coming around her, holding her close. They made love that night with a tenderness that brought tears to Florence's eyes. Wesley was patient and careful, attentive to her needs, and afterward, as they lay tangled together in the warm aftermath, Florence felt complete in a way she had not felt since before Robert's death. She had not betrayed his memory by loving again. She had honored it by choosing to live. February brought a thaw, and with it, the first signs that spring might eventually arrive. Wesley asked Florence to marry him on Valentine's Day, presenting her with a simple gold ring he had somehow acquired during a trip to town for supplies. "I know I do not have much to offer you," he said, down on one knee in the kitchen where they had shared so many meals. "But I have my hands, my back, my heart, and my promise to love you faithfully for the rest of my days. Will you marry me, Florence?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." They rode to Virginia City as soon as the weather permitted and were married by the circuit preacher in a simple ceremony with the general store owner and his wife as witnesses. Florence wore her best dress, and Wesley had cleaned up until he was almost unrecognizable as the dusty cowboy who had ridden up to her homestead 6 months earlier. Returning to the homestead, as husband and wife, felt right in a way Florence could not quite articulate. This was still the place she had built with Robert, but it was also becoming the place she was building with Wesley. The past and present wove together, each honoring the other. Spring arrived in earnest in March, bringing mud and melting snow and the exhausting work of calving season. Florence and Wesley worked side by side, delivering calves, doctoring sick animals, repairing winter damage. They were partners in every sense of the word, and Florence marveled at how much easier everything was with someone to share the load. In early April, she realized she was pregnant. The discovery brought a complicated mix of emotions. She was 42 years old, had long since given up on the possibility of children after years of trying unsuccessfully with Robert. But here she was, carrying Wesley's child, and the joy of it mixed with fear of the risks at her age. Wesley was over the moon when she told him. He lifted her up and spun her around, laughing with pure delight. "We are going to have a baby, Florence. This is wonderful." "I am old for this," she cautioned. "There are risks." "We will face them together," he said firmly. "Just like we face everything. You are strong, and I will be right beside you every step of the way." Summer was busy with all the work of maintaining the homestead, but Wesley insisted Florence rest more than she was accustomed to. He took on the heavier tasks without complaint, and they hired a young man from town to help with the most demanding work. Florence chafed at the restrictions at first, but she recognized the wisdom in being careful. As her belly grew, Wesley's tenderness grew with it. He talked to the baby every night, his hand on her stomach, telling their child about the homestead and the mountains and all the things they would do together. Florence fell in love with him all over again, watching him prepare for fatherhood with such obvious joy. Autumn arrived, and with it, the time for the baby's arrival. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Florence feared she might not survive it. But Wesley stayed with her throughout, holding her hand, encouraging her, refusing to leave even when the midwife from town suggested he might prefer to wait elsewhere. Their son was born on a clear October morning, healthy and squalling with indignation at his entrance into the world. Wesley held him with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face, and Florence felt her heart expand in ways she had not imagined possible. "What should we name him?" Wesley asked, carefully passing the baby to Florence. "Robert," she said without hesitation. "Robert Wesley Randall." Honoring the past and the present, Wesley's eyes filled with fresh tears. "That is perfect." The first year of their son's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and infinite joy. Little Robert was a happy baby, thriving on the attention of both parents. Florence watched Wesley with their son, and fell deeper in love with this man who had ridden into her life when she most needed him, even if she had not known it at the time. The homestead prospered under their joint management. They added more cattle, improved the buildings, and slowly transformed the property from a barely sustainable operation into a thriving ranch. Other homesteaders in the area began to notice, began to ask Wesley's advice on this or that, and Florence found herself part of a community again instead of isolated and alone. When Robert was 2, Florence discovered she was pregnant again. This time there was less fear and more excitement. She knew what to expect, and her first pregnancy had gone well despite her age. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1881, and they named her Grace after Wesley's mother. 2 children made the house feel truly complete. Laughter and noise filled rooms that had been silent for so long. Florence sometimes paused in her work to simply watch her family, to marvel at the abundance that had come from that day when she had almost turned Wesley away. "What are you thinking?" Wesley asked one evening, catching her watching him play with the children on the floor. "I am thinking about how close I came to sending you away," Florence said. "How different my life would be if I had not taken that chance." Wesley stood and came to her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "I would not have left easily. Something told me the moment I saw you that you were worth fighting for, that this place, this life, was what I had been searching for. I am glad you are stubborn," Florence said, leaning back against his chest. "I learned from the best," he teased, and she elbowed him gently. The years rolled on, bringing challenges and triumphs in equal measure. Droughts tested their water resources. Hard winters tested their preparations. Market fluctuations tested their financial management. But they faced everything together, partners in all things, and their love deepened with each shared struggle and victory. Robert and Grace grew up strong and capable, learning the ranch work from both parents. Robert had his namesake's love for the land and Wesley's steady patience. Grace had Florence's determination and her father's sense of humor. Watching them develop into their own people filled Florence with a pride she had never imagined feeling. When Florence was 50, they celebrated with a party that brought together their neighbors and friends. The house was full of people and noise and life, and Florence stood on her porch looking out at the homestead that had been forged through determination, grief, hard work, and love. Wesley came out to join her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Quite a turnout." "Quite a life," Florence replied, leaning into him. "I stood on this porch 12 years ago with a rifle ready to send you away. I was so certain I did not need anyone. But you took a chance on a dusty cowboy," Wesley said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Best decision either of us ever made." Inside, Robert was playing his guitar while Grace danced with some of the neighbor children. The sound of music and laughter drifted out into the Montana twilight, and Florence felt a completeness that went beyond contentment into something approaching bliss. "You ever regret it?" she asked Wesley. "Staying here instead of finding your own place." "This is my own place," Wesley said firmly. "Our place. From the moment you let me start mending that fence, this became home. You became home. Everything I was looking for I found right here." They stood together watching the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple and rose. The land that had demanded so much from Florence, that she had defended alone for 5 long years, now thrived under their joint care. The homestead that had been born from one man's dream and preserved by one woman's stubbornness had become a true home for a family built on love and partnership. "I love you," Florence said, the words still carrying the weight of wonder even after years of marriage. "I love you too," Wesley replied. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days after." As darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast Montana sky, they returned to the warmth of their home and their family. The rifle that Florence had greeted Wesley with on that long-ago autumn day hung over the mantel now, a reminder of harder times and the strength it took to survive them. But it was no longer needed as a constant companion. The homestead was defended not by one woman alone, but by a partnership forged in trust and sealed with love. Years later, when Robert and Grace had families of their own and the original homestead had expanded into a substantial ranch, Florence and Wesley would sit on that same porch in the evenings, watching grandchildren play in the yard. The memories of those early days, of defense and determination and the slow building of trust, had been folded into the larger story of a life well lived together. "Tell us again," one of the grandchildren would inevitably ask, "about how grandfather came to stay." Florence would smile, reaching for Wesley's hand, and begin the story. "I was standing right here with my Winchester, ready to send him on his way. I had been alone for 5 years and thought I did not need anyone, but this stubborn cowboy would not take no for an answer. Because I knew," Wesley would interject, squeezing her hand, "the moment I saw her, that I had found where I belonged. It just took a little time to convince her of the same thing." The children would laugh, and Florence would continue the tale, speaking of fence mending and barn repairs, of a terrible winter and shared warmth, of fear giving way to trust and trust giving way to love. She would tell them about their father and aunt as babies, about building the ranch together, about all the years that had followed that pivotal moment of decision. But the heart of the story was always the same, that sometimes the things we need most come to us when we least expect them, that strength does not always mean standing alone, and that the greatest courage is not in defending what we have but in opening our hearts to new possibilities. Florence Fletcher Randall lived to be 73 years old, and when she passed peacefully in her sleep with Wesley beside her, the homestead she had defended alone for 5 years and built with him for 31 more stood as a testament to the power of determination, love, and partnership. Wesley followed her 18 months later, and they were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the valley, where the wind carried the scent of pine, and the mountains stood eternal watch. Their descendants continue to work the land today, and the story of Florence and Wesley has been passed down through generations. It is a story of the Wild West, of survival and determination, but most of all, it is a story of love, unexpected, hard-won, and enduring as the Montana landscape itself. In the end, the homestead that Florence had defended with such fierce independence became not a monument to solitary strength, but to the power of two people building something together. The cowboy who rode up that autumn day in 1878 truly never left, and in staying, he helped create a legacy that would endure for generations. The rifle over the mantel, the original homestead cabin now dwarfed by later additions, the split-rail fence that Wesley had first repaired, all remained as physical reminders of where it all began. But the true legacy was in the love story itself, in the lesson that sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves become prisons, and sometimes the greatest act of courage is letting someone in. Florence had thought she was defending her homestead alone, but in reality, she had been waiting, whether she knew it or not, for someone who would see past her defenses to the woman beneath, who would prove himself worthy of her trust, and who would stand beside her not as a savior or a burden but as an equal partner in all things. That was the story their grandchildren carried forward, along with the land itself. That love, when it comes, is worth the risk of opening your heart again, no matter how many times it has been broken. That partnership is not weakness but strength multiplied. And that sometimes, the best decisions we make are the ones where we choose to set down our weapons and let ourselves be vulnerable with someone who has earned the right to stand beside us. The Montana Territory, where Florence first defended her homestead, eventually became the state of Montana, civilization creeping gradually into the wild spaces. But the essential character of the place remained, demanding strength and rewarding determination. The Fletcher Randall Ranch became a respected operation, known for quality livestock and fair dealing, and Florence and Wesley's reputation as partners in business and in life became the standard by which other couples in the area measured their own relationships. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and the children were in bed, Florence and Wesley would often return to that porch where it all began. They would sit in companionable silence, watching the familiar landscape shift and change with the light, and between them would flow all the accumulated history of their years together, all the struggles and triumphs, all the ordinary moments that had woven together into an extraordinary life. "I still think about that day," Wesley would sometimes say, "about how close I came to riding on when you pointed that rifle at me." "I am glad you were too stubborn to take a hint," Florence would reply, the same gentle teasing that had become a comfortable pattern between them. "I am glad you were brave enough to take a chance," Wesley would counter. "Not everyone would have done that, And Florence would think about how true that was, how many factors had to align perfectly for their story to unfold as it did. If Wesley had come a day earlier or later, if she had been in a different mood or more frightened or less desperately aware of the work that needed doing, if he had said something different or pushed too hard or not been patient enough to prove himself trustworthy, any one of 1,000 small changes could have altered everything. But it had happened exactly as it did, and from those tentative beginnings had grown something that neither of them could have anticipated. A love that was tested by time and hardship and proved strong enough to support not just 2 lives but a family, a homestead, a legacy that would endure. As Florence's health began to fail in her later years, Wesley cared for her with the same patient attention he had brought to everything else in their life together. He read to her when her eyes grew too weak, helped her walk when her legs grew unsteady, and held her hand through the long nights when pain made sleep difficult. And Florence, who had once been so determined to manage everything alone, allowed herself to lean on him, to accept his care and his love without reservation. "I am not afraid," she told him one evening when they both knew her time was growing short. "I have had a good life, a full life. More than I ever expected after Robert died. You gave me everything," Wesley said, his voice thick with emotion. "A home, a family, a purpose. I was just drifting before I found you. You made me whole." "We made each other whole," Florence corrected gently. "That is what love does. It does not complete us, we are already complete, but it makes us better, stronger, more than we could be alone." Those were the words that sustained Wesley through the grief of losing her, and later they were the words inscribed on both their headstones. "Together, we were more than alone." Simple words, but they captured the essence of their story, the truth that had guided them through 3 decades of partnership. The homestead itself remained in the family, passed down to Robert, then to his children, each generation adding their own chapter to the story, while honoring the foundation that Florence and Wesley had built. The original cabin was preserved, turned into a small museum of sorts where family members could see the tools Florence had used, the rifle she had held that first day, the carved meadowlark Wesley had given her for Christmas, carefully preserved and treasured. And on certain clear autumn days, when the light was just right and the wind carried the scent of pine and approaching winter, people claimed you could still feel the presence of Florence and Wesley on that porch, still sense the love and determination that had transformed a struggling homestead into a thriving ranch, still hear the echo of a conversation about fences and work, and the slow building of trust between 2 wounded people brave enough to try again. Their story became part of the fabric of Montana itself, one of thousands of stories of people who came west looking for something: land, opportunity, escape, redemption. But unlike many of those stories that ended in failure or tragedy, Florence and Wesley's story had a different ending. It was a story about finding not just land but home, not just survival but life, not just another person but the right person, at exactly the right time. And so the homestead stood, generation after generation, a testament to the truth that strength comes in many forms, that vulnerability is not weakness, and that sometimes the best thing we can do is lower our weapons and open our gates to let love in. Florence had defended her homestead alone for 5 years, but she had built it into something lasting with Wesley by her side, and that made all the difference. The Montana sky remained vast and unforgiving. The winters still tested those who chose to live there, and the land still demanded respect and hard work from everyone who tried to tame it. But it also rewarded those who proved themselves worthy, and there were few who had proved themselves more worthy than Florence Fletcher Randall and Wesley Randall, who found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together in the wild heart of the American West. Their love story was not without hardship or struggle. They had disagreements and difficult times, moments when the pressures of ranch life strained their partnership, seasons when money was tight or illness struck, or the sheer relentlessness of the work threatened to overwhelm them. But they had learned early in their relationship the importance of communication, of honesty, of facing problems together rather than alone. And through it all, they never forgot that moment on the porch, that choice Florence had made to let Wesley stay, that choice Wesley had made to keep riding toward a homestead where he had heard a woman might need help. Those choices, made in good faith by two people who had every reason to be cautious but chose to be brave instead, had rippled out into decades of consequences, into lives created and shaped, into a legacy that would outlive them both. This was the real story of the American West, not just the tales of gunfighters and gold rushes, but the quieter, deeper stories of people who built lives and families in impossible places, who loved fiercely despite the knowledge that life was fragile and nothing was guaranteed. Florence and Wesley's story was one of millions, but it was theirs, unique and precious, and it mattered. In the end, that is what all the best love stories teach us, that our individual stories matter, that the choices we make about who to let into our lives have profound consequences, and that love, real love, is not about grand gestures but about showing up every day, doing the work, being present, and choosing each other over and over again through whatever life brings. Florence Fletcher defended her homestead alone for 5 years, and then Wesley Randall rode up and never left. That simple sentence contained multitudes: loss and healing, fear and courage, independence and partnership, the past and the future. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth passing down through generations as a reminder that the best things in life often come when we least expect them, and that sometimes the greatest adventure is not defending what we have but opening our hearts to what we might have if we are brave enough to say yes to possibility. And there, on the Montana hillside where they rested together, with the wind singing through the pines and the mountains standing watch as they always had, Florence and Wesley remained forever a part of the land they had loved and worked and defended together. Their story complete, their love eternal, their legacy secured in the hearts and lives of everyone who came after them.